What's up, guys? Welcome back to the lab. I am definitely Benny. So excited to have you guys here for our fourth video on the Dominion series where we're talking about the walking skeleton. Let's get into it. I mentioned the walking skeleton 2 videos ago. I was supposed to talk about it last video and I just got to thinking about it and I was like, I really want to just spend time kind of digging into the walking skeleton on its own. So that's why I decided to make it its own video today. Honestly, because it has helped me tremendously in my software engineering journey. It has really helped me out on larger projects to know where to begin, how to start with the projects. And so I really wanted to just take a few minutes to talk about the walking skeleton on its own before kind of diving into the rest of our project here. So to get started, ask yourself this question. When we start on a new project, where do we begin? On a console app or on a couple line script for nothing, then it's a non-starter, right? You just write it and you're done. But when you're working on larger, more complex projects that have dozens, if not hundreds of different components, a lot of moving pieces, a lot to it, and then you add on top of that architecture, infrastructure, CI/CD pipelines, testing, and it becomes a monumental undertaking to begin a project. And a lot of the times the biggest question is, well, where do we begin? And I suggest to you today, you begin with the walking skeleton. Now, what is the walking skeleton? There's a lot of definitions out there and you can go Google all of them. The one that I like to use the most is the simplest. It's the thinnest horizontal slice across all components of your project. Well, let's break that down. What does that actually mean, Benny? Well, it's got 2 parts, and I'm going to start with the second part first, and the first part will then make a ton of sense, right? A horizontal slice across all components of your project. Now, as developers, we like to look at that and think of, okay, it's all of my classes, but there's a lot more to software engineering and software in general than just your code. There's functionality in classes for sure, but there's also, like I said earlier, infrastructure, architecture, CI/CD pipelines, testing, and so much more.
But I'm not done yet. Call right now and I'll triple the offer.
That are also necessary for your project to get off the ground. The thinnest horizontal slice across all components, so there's that first piece. Let's take the smallest amount of work to represent every single component of your project from top to bottom, left to right, start to finish, however you want to phrase it. A better, more thorough definition, and I'm going to read it from my screen, so excuse me if my eyes aren't looking right at you guys. A walking skeleton must be able to carry out the basic functions required of the end system, such as querying data sources, requesting services, and conducting functions. Any automation, such as exception handling and continuous integration, should also be in place, and all implemented components should be tested. That's a lot. And it's a mouthful, and I hope you understand why I started off with my own definition first. But it means the same thing, right? We want to have everything in place in its most basic form. And I think that's where a lot of people get tripped up when they start doing the walking skeleton. And trust me, I did it myself. So let's talk about a common pitfall with the walking skeleton. The biggest common pitfall is not taking the thinnest slice that you possibly can. On my first ever time doing the walking skeleton, I was told I need an endpoint, I need a test to test that endpoint for integration testing, and I need some type of method to unit test. So I went out and I started creating controllers, and I had all this logic, and then we had all the testing, so I needed interfaces as well, and it was too much. I ended up taking a week and a half just to get this kind of basic thing done, and I blew the deadline. Come now, a couple weeks ago, I did another walking skeleton for a project. It took me a day, and that same setup, an endpoint, an integration test, and a unit test. That's my portion. There's other people working on the rest of it. The endpoint took me about 30 seconds to set up. The unit test said assert true, and the integration test hit the endpoint and was just looking for a 200 OK to show us that we could hit the endpoint and we could test it, right? After about 2 more days, we had CI/CD pipelines in place and Azure Kubernetes clusters set up to show deployments. We had everything in place, right, to start and begin our project. So in reality, the walking skeleton, while being the thinnest horizontal slice across all components, should really be the base framework for you to begin your project. Because at that point, you can go out and say, okay, I'm ready to work on any of these things. They all need to be implemented, but I can work on any of them now. And the rest of them are there. Whether they're mocked out, whether they're stubbed, or whether they're just a bare minimum implementation, they are there and you have a working thing. The walking skeleton is exactly what it sounds like. No meat on the bones. It's just bones. It is also important to remember that part of the idea of the walking skeleton is that it walks, right? So we have the skeleton portion, and that it is bare bones, no meat. But we have the first part, which is it walks. And by walks, we mean it's always in a state where we can demo it. And that sounds really daunting, but it really isn't. If we plan out our work items or our stories or our tasks or whatever you want to call them, well, and we communicate clearly with other teams that may possibly be working on this at the same time, we can always have our development environment or our QA environment, wherever you want to state it's going to be, we can always have that in a demoable state. So that way when product or when your customers or whoever comes up and says, I want to see that project you're working on, you can show them in an instant. And you don't have to worry about, oh man, I just broke it a couple days ago. It should never have been broken in the first place, right? So your walking skeleton needs to be able to walk, and it needs to be bare bones implementation as much as possible. So let's talk about this in the context of our Dominion simulator. We don't have a lot to it, but there are still quite a few pieces that we want to make sure are implemented for us to complete our walking skeleton. So as far as the software, the program itself goes, we have three major components: the game, the messaging service, and the player. But we also have intricate parts of each one of those that we want to make sure are surfaced in the walking skeleton, even if they are just stubs. We want to have something that reads cards. We want to have something that plays cards. Now, what does that mean? That's up for you to decide. We also need to make sure that we have testing, unit testing, integration testing, and if possible, end-to-end tests. And remember, thinnest horizontal slice, they don't actually have to do anything. They can be very bare minimum implementations to show that we have testing, but not that the product is tested. That's going to come later when we actually start developing things. But for now, an assertion just to show that you have a testing framework in place is all you really need. Integration tests can just come back and say, hey, we had a 200. Or hey, we were able to hit the database and get out a predefined record that you already put in there. Or hey, we were able to hit that service. It didn't even come back as 200. It came back as a 401 because we haven't set up authorization. But that's okay. At least we were able to talk to it. Now, there's a lot of benefits to the walking skeleton, like I mentioned, right? It's always in a state that's demoable. It's the thinnest horizontal slice, which means it's able to be the framework from which we build. It's going to grow upwards, right? It is bare bones, though, so we can get it out quickly, and we can quickly start showing product or the customers or whoever that our thing is working. We have a little thing going on here that you can see. There's progress, so it's visible. There's all these things, and those are great, but I think the most important one that we get out of the walking skeleton is it shows us very early on where some of our biggest holes are in terms of integration between components. If you set up a walking skeleton and you go, cool, I'm going to need a database, I'm going to need to talk to this, this, and this, and then come to find out when you implement it in a very basic way that, oh, I'm not getting 401s or I'm not getting 200s like I expected from this service. It's getting me 404s, like it can't even find it. Is the URL right? And then come to find out it's actually a networking issue that you got to go solve. Well, guess what? We just figured it out at the very beginning of our project, which means we're not worried when we go to start getting ready to put it out in production. We've already found it. We already know about it. We're aware of it, and we can solve it from the very beginning to make sure that these pieces are integrated all the time. I think that's one of the best benefits that you get from the walking skeleton because it shows you those potholes very early into the process, as opposed to waiting to the last minute to integrate your front end and back end, or your back end and your database, so on and so forth. So I hope that makes sense as to one, why I wanted to talk about this on its own, but two, why the walking skeleton is important and why I love it so much and why I think it's very, very awesome for developers to start with. I hope that you guys consider using the walking skeleton in your programming projects or whatever you're working on in the near future. I think it's a highly valuable skill to learn, and it's extremely difficult to do the first time. Don't be discouraged if you end up blowing it way out of proportion. Your walking skeleton is going to look very different from mine, but I hope that all of us can eventually figure out how to get it to be as thin as possible. In the next video, we're actually going to start with code. I know, so exciting. Oh, it's going to be amazing. I'm so excited to actually write code again. But we're going to start with code. We're actually going to do the walking skeleton. It might be a little bit of a longer video as I dive into the code a little bit more and explain it, but I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible. We are going to jump into the walking skeleton, though, and start implementing the features of the Dominion simulator. Can't wait to see you guys there. Catch you next time.